Comrades, welcome to the Socialist Action Public Forum. This is a joint effort with the Socialist Action U of T Club as well as the Cross Country Party. Tonight is our first in-person forum in this building in Oise U of T in nearly 3 years. So welcome back. My name is Sean In. I'm one of the organizing members of the Socialist Action U of T Club, as well as SMASH U of T, which stands for Students Mobilizing Against Systemic Hardship. As a resident Don, I also participated in the union organizing drive that created a bargaining unit for the U of T Dons under the United Steelworkers Union as well. Alongside me is Elizabeth Weiss. She is the federal treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and a past secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. Elizabeth is also a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers as well. She will be chairing the Q&A segment of this meeting tonight. We acknowledge that this event today is taking place on stolen Indigenous land on Turtle Island, known as North America. Here we live and work on unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We recognize that in the early 18th century, the Crown purchased the massive land of Metro Toronto, which spans from Etobicoke to Woodbine, from the people of the Mississaugas for only 10 shillings, which is equivalent for $60 today. They also purchased the massive land between Lake Erie to Lake Ontario for only 30 units of clothing. In a series of unfair treaties and mass violence, the Crown stole 99.999% of the land from the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That means seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. And tonight, we are so excited to present, in person also, Yves Engler to launch his new book, Stand on Guard for Whom, A People's History of the Canadian Military. Hundreds of books describe different aspects of the Canadian military and warfare. Stand on Guard for Whom, A People's History of the Canadian Military, is the only and the first to tackle this subject from the perspective of those harmed or disenfranchised by the Canadian wars, repression, and military culture. Rooted in a British force that brutally dispossessed First Nations, the Canadian forces regularly quelled labor unrest in the decades after the Confederation. Stand on Guard for Whom examines wars in Sudan, South Africa, Europe, Korea, Iraq, Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya, as well as the Canadian gunboat diplomacy and the UN deployments that ousted democratically elected governments from other countries. This book details the military's role in chemical and biological weapons development, as well as nuclear weapons proliferation. It also documents the immense ecological footprint, the patriarchy, the racism, and the anti-democratic culture of the Canadian forces. Yves Engler has been dubbed Canada's version of Noam Chomsky by Georgia Strait, one of the most important voices on the Canadian left by Briarpatch, In the Mold of Eye of Stone by Globe and Mail, part of that rare but growing group of social critics unafraid to confront Canada's self-satisfied myths by Quill and Quire. And Yves Engler has also published 12 other books, his latest being Stand on Guard for Whom, A People's History of the Canadian Military. Please join me in welcoming
Thanks. It was a very good morning. I I took the 7 a.m. train from Guelph, and Chrystia Freeland was speaking at a Ukraine business conference, how to profit off of it. Literally, one of the speakers actually said, a piece, we want to get a piece of the action, well, I didn't use the word action, but piece of the post war profit-making possibilities. And so I actually interrupted Chrystia Freeland at the conference, so I'm very happy with that. But then I'm less happy about Canada losing to Belgium in a game they deserve to win. And I had some drinks with my old friend watching the game, so if I go off track, well.
Love the game on Sunday.
So yeah, this is my latest book. It's actually the biggest book, Stand on Guard for Whom, A Peaceful History of the Canadian Military. And unlike maybe some of my other books, I can't say that it was, I did an exhaustive research. I did lots of research, but there are literally thousands and thousands of books about Canadian military, and I can't say I read them all. I could say close to that with Canada and Africa and some other things I've done, but not in this case. But I did look at a lot of military history, and it's just such a massive institution. It's been involved in so many wrongs that it's quite a extensive domain to look at. But this is, I think, the first critical overview looking at the military from the standpoint of those dispossessed, those disenfranchised by the military. And there's many, many facets to that. One of the ones that's gotten some attention in last year or year and a half or whatever is the incredible level of sexual assault, sexual misconduct, patriarchal attitudes, et cetera, within the Canadian military. And it's fascinating to see the deference. We have a prime minister who claims to be a feminist, have feminist policy, and obviously that's dubious. But there's just so many articles about basically, it seems like almost every leader of the Canadian military being involved in some rape or other sexual misconduct allegations, and yet it took so much for even the most minimal government interventions on the question, and that speaks to just the deference we give to this institution. When it comes to understanding the sexism in the Canadian military, we shouldn't be particularly surprised, right? This is an institution that didn't allow women onto submarines until 2000, right? This is, it had very open discrimination based on gender until not that long ago. It's also, it represents sort of toxic masculinity, sort of institutional embodiment of that. And one of the indicators pointing in that direction, many indicators, of course, is the fact that the two worst examples of patriarchal violence in this country were committed, historically, were committed by people who were either in the military or who wanted to be in the military. The Polytechnique massacre, and then, of course, the Van massacre here in Toronto a few years ago. And we see that just a couple days ago, people may have seen that story about the anti-woke speech that the former general receiving the Vimy Award gave, Michel Maisonneuve. So even in the context of the government finally saying we got to deal with this sexism within this institution, there's a pushback within the in this case a retired but a long-standing and important former member of the military. So the military in many ways represents some of the worst cultural tendencies, right? Very authoritarian institution. A history of overt racism, right? Into the 1950s, in the Navy and the Air Force, recruits needed to be of, quote, pure European descent and of the white race. Right? This was open. it wasn't always universally applied. Mostly it was applied to the Air Force, the pilots, and the more prestigious positions. There were some non-white people that were able to get around the racist requirements, but this was official policy, not always applied 100%. And the military, when we talk about this is an institution of enormous size, right? I think most people don't understand just how significant of an institution it is. We're talking about around 70,000 soldiers, around 30,000 reservists, and another 25,000 Department of National Defense employees. And the budget is getting towards $30 billion. And when we compare this, we're talking about like 15 times the size of Environment and Climate Change Canada, right, in terms of its budget. So this is the sort of priorities. And then we also have Veterans Affairs, right? Veterans Affairs is a whole other, around $6 billion, I believe, budget, around 4,000 employees on top. So Veterans Affairs alone is 2 or 3 times the size of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Biggest infrastructure portfolio in the federal government, 20,000 buildings, 5,500 kilometers of roads, 3,000 kilometers of waterworks. Canadian bases, the land mass is about half the size of Switzerland, right? So just an enormous institution. And its ecological impact is also massive. Right? And so 59% of federal government greenhouse gas emissions are the military. But Trudeau, in his net zero plan, the military is excluded. Right? So 60% is excluded from the net zero plan. And the same dynamic goes on internationally in the climate negotiations, right? Military's emissions aren't counted in part of the reduction targets. So, the things like schools and medical stuff, we got to reduce emissions there, but the things like kill people, that's just too important to concern ourselves with. And it goes way beyond just greenhouse gas emissions in terms of ecological toll. Of course, warfare is incredibly destructive to the environment, and the military's got odious histories of dumping waste and oil spills and et cetera, et cetera. And I go into some of that in the book. Back to the question of just how significant of an institution it is. It's the only federally funded degree-granting university. It's the Royal Military College, which is obviously under the D&D. It's got about 24 other schools, so like the Canadian Forces School of Meteorology, the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers School. So huge educational institution. The military has the largest public relations apparatus in the country, right? No other institution has, we don't know exactly how many, but one estimate is 660 people working in public relations, right?
Wow.
Mostly close to full time. And that doesn't count like their history department, their museum, but they have a whole history department is like the size of, probably not quite as big as UST's history department, but probably as big as Toronto Metropolitan University's history department, like a significant, like a size of a decent sized university's history department. They have a whole museums section, and then Veterans Affairs, of course, also spends millions of dollars on Remembrance Day and other glorification of military. So it's a huge public relations propaganda apparatus. Also, it has the largest intelligence gathering capacities, right? So the military itself has huge numbers. It's not exactly clear. Of course, they don't publicize it, but I've seen different numbers going up to like around 2,000 people engaged in intelligence within the military. And then the communication security establishment has been under Department of National Defense. Communications Security Establishment is kind of like, you know, Canada's NSA, and I think it's over 3,000, around 3,000 employees of the CSE. And we know the military has been caught, publicly reported on, spying on Black Lives Matter, on Idle No More, on Occupy, and other left-wing progressive political movements. One of the questions I'm trying to answer or put forward in the book is you know, the title, which is Stand on Guard for Who, right? Who is this institution protecting or defending? And its roots are as in the British military, right? The military that conquered these lands, that dispossessed indigenous people, that, you know, put bounties on the head of Mi'kmaq, that suppressed the revolts in the prairies. It's also, the roots are things like the Royal Military College, which was set up in 1876 to, as one military historian, official military employee of D&D put it, to train proper white gentlemen to be officers of British imperialism, right? And there are all kinds of graduates of RMC that helped the British conquer West Africa, became governors, colonial governors, even in Ghana and northern Nigeria, that helped the British Empire conquer Afghanistan, many parts of the world. So the institution flows out of the British colonial project, and it's one-to-one, right? The naval base in Halifax was one day British, and the next day it's Canadian. Same thing on Vancouver Island. So that's its roots and, you know, part of where it comes out of. One element in researching the book that I found interesting, I heard, knew a little bit about, but I didn't really know the depth, is the extent to which the military, or specifically the militia, was used to suppress strikes, right? From 1867 to 1933, they get called out 70 times, basically once a year, to suppress a strike. Officially, it was always like, you know, making sure everything's in order, but invariably it was on the side of the employers. And then sometimes it was, some of the instances became pretty intense. So there's obviously this class component, and that class component continues right until today, less crassly than an earlier time, but nonetheless continues. And if you look at like what the strikes were about, of course, was like union recognition, all things that we consider basic, 10-hour work days and basic wage questions and health and safety issues, etc. So that's the question of like who this institution is protecting. The other part to this is the whole international question, and we just passed Remembrance Day, and we talk about lest we forget. And if you look at the history of Canadian warfare, you'll find that there's only one war that you could even make a case that was like morally justifiable, right? The 400 Canadians that were sent to Sudan in 1884 to help the British, that were indigenous forces were under assault in they were trying to get Khartoum. The British forces were under assault from indigenous forces. Obviously, that wasn't justifiable. The Canadians, the 7,000 Canadians that sent to South Africa in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to participate in the Boer War, where 20,000 Boer women and children were put into concentration, or not all women and children, most women and children died in concentration camps. We think British didn't keep records, we don't know exactly, but a similar number of black South Africans that died. And that war was about what? That war was about the minerals of South Africa and the British trade route to the very profitable colony in India, and controlling the geostrategic position. The 400,000 or so Canadians that fought in World War I, well, what do they do? Canada in World War I, beyond this war being a monstrous inter-imperial conflict that led to all kinds of 9,000 Canadians being killed to get this little hill, just death and destruction for so little in terms of land, let alone bigger questions. During World War I, you had Canadians that helped the British conquer West Africa. You had Canadians that a little bit less in East Africa, helped conquer Palestine. Canadians that garrisoned the British colonies in the Caribbean. Absolutely, unequivocally, World War I was morally unjustifiable. The Korean War, 27,000 Canadians that fought in the Korean War, in a war that left 3 million or so dead. And basically, it was a civil war in large part, that we just massively expanded. They stopped bombing. At one point, the Americans stopped bombing North Korea because all buildings of more than 2 stories had been destroyed. What motivated the Korean War? Right? This was partly about pump priming the economy. After the World War II helped get out of the Depression, there was a downturn, economic downturn, and basically Korean War is starting the modern military-industrial complex, constant public spending on the war machine. Additionally, it was about China in '49, the year before. Mao's forces win, and it was basically partly a war, against China. The first Iraq War, right? 4,000 Canadians approximately participated in one way or another. And as Mark Curtis put it, this was the open rehabilitation of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East, right? This is part of deepening the American footprint in the region that has led to just incredible destruction over the past 3 decades. Bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, right? 530 bombs, I believe it was, the Canadian fighter jets dropped on Yugoslavia, and almost 3 months of bombing, based upon reasserting NATO, based upon dividing up ethnically, final stage of dividing up Yugoslavia, and about pushing the privatization agenda, right? Afghanistan, 40,000 Canadians that fought in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. Look where we're at now, right? Taliban looks moderate compared to ISIS-K, and how many Afghans? We don't know how many died, but certainly over 100,000, possibly hundreds of thousands. Libya, 2011. Canada bombing of Libya. The Canadian general led the NATO bombing of Libya.
Charles Bouchard.
Charles Bouchard.
The next year he resigned and became the head of Lockheed Martin Canada.
To try to sell the F-35, right? Right. So what was Libya? I mean, at one point in Libya, the Canadian fighter pilots were joking that they were Al-Qaeda's air force, because they knew that the rebels they were backing were extremist forces. They were joking about it. The military had reports before the war, going back actually ways before that, that said that the likely consequence is going to be instability. It's going to be, basically a breaking up of Libya as a state. And 11 years later, where are things at? You still have basically like a civil war going on in Libya. So the only war that
Excuse me, sister. Wait till he's finished, okay? Because if we all interrupt him, he would never get through. And at the end, in your intervention,
I won't be
you
that
can
much
say-
longer, I promise.
No, you gotta finish your
I know I've been
answer.
going on, but But so you looked at history, there's only one war that you could even make the case was morally justifiable. That's World War II. And then obviously with World War II, there's all kinds of things that Canada did beforehand in terms of enabling fascism and stuff like that. So that's the history of, a very brief, of course, overview of the history of Canadian warfare. And so Canada, contrary to the mythology, has been a very warlike nation. And you see today, right, a time when we're not formally at war, it's like 20 or so international missions that the Canadian military is part of. Most of them are small, right? Like they got some Canadians as part of the UN command, essentially American command from the Korean War in South Korea. You have some Canadians that are part of the Operation Proteus that are training basically a Palestinian security force to oversee the occupation. You have bigger one in Iraq, and then the biggest one that gets a little bit of attention recently in Latvia, where you have, in the last 5 years, Canadian troops on Russia's border. But so it's just this very forward, if you want to use it, term, posture of the Canadian military. The Canadian military has been trying to set up bases in different parts of the world. The plan was to set up 7 bases. There's 3 confirmed in Kuwait, Jamaica, and Germany. The plan was also Tanzania, South Korea, Singapore, and as explicitly about projecting combat power alongside the Pentagon, like to work with Pentagon's plan for combat projecting power globally. The book, as was mentioned in the intro, has a section on the history of Canadian gunboat diplomacy. Probably the most interesting example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy historically is and I should, before saying this, Canadian Navy is all around the world, right? Constantly all around the world, and there's been last few weeks stories about like concern because there's no Canadian naval vessel in European waters right now for the first time in 8 years, because they've been sending a whole bunch of vessels over towards China, focusing on China, and right after Russia's invasion, they added another vessel, and so there's this like small gap where there's not another Canadian vessel like in the North Sea or I guess in the Baltic. And so there's like, sort of concern, we don't have enough military assets to have vessels, we're gonna have some around China, we're gonna have some around Russia, we're gonna have some around Somalia, we're gonna make sure also forget about the Caribbean, and right, this is the constant normal, non-wartime normal of the Canadian Navy. Probably the most egregious or the most interesting example of Canadian gunboat diplomacy was in 1921, when the Royal Bank loaned money to a Federico Tinoco, who's a Costa Rican leader, just before he was ousted in popular protest, and he was corrupt, unliked, and he took the money with him. And the new government said, we're not paying, this is odious debt. And there was negotiations for quite a while between Royal Bank and the government, and then finally the Canadian government sent a couple of naval vessels to make the point that you should pay our bank back and help Royal Bank in their negotiations with Costa Rica. Also, a section on the special forces. Special forces operate secretly, so don't really know where they get deployed. That's part of their appeal from the government standpoint, so they can deploy them and don't tell anybody about it. So for instance, in February 2019, Canadian Special Forces were videoed at the Port-au-Prince airport in Haiti, and it was never announced publicly. We don't really know why they were there. In 2004, when U.S. Marines took Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the elected president, and put him on a plane and dumped him in the Central African Republic, Canadian Special Forces were at the Toussaint Louverture Airport in Port-au-Prince, securing the airport. So there's a whole history, and Ukraine today, right? Ukraine, there's Canadian Special Forces that's come out, New York Times and Global News confirmed that there are Canadian Special Forces on the ground in Ukraine, which is just one element. I won't get into it. We can get into it in the discussion if people want. One element of how Canada's actually effectively at war with Russia in Ukraine. The book also has a section on chemical and biological weapons, U.S. testing of Agent Orange in Canada, all kinds of fascinating and troubling elements of biological and chemical weapons testing. They tested it on basically on poor people who were tended to be not English speaking, often illiterate. All kinds of horrible tests on our own soldiers. All kinds of kind of shocking stories like that. Shellfish toxin that Canadian forces created that the Americans used to try to assassinate, not 100%, but almost for sure, to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. There's obviously, there's a number of chapters that deal with the sort of economic side to the military, which is significant, and the role of the military and military funding in spurring technological development. So the first computers were created by the military, and military spending and different university programs to expand that, and how the military kind of can be used, and military spending can be used as a way to subsidize corporate sectors, sort of technological progress, all stuff about the arms exports, and the extent to which, when we talk about Canada selling weapons abroad, we don't talk enough about just the extent to which the state enables that. And I don't just mean in when we hear about it, usually it's that, there was an export permit granted by the government. But in fact, it was way deeper than that, right? You have the trade commissioners that are promoting the Canadian arms industry abroad. You have Canadian military, sometimes for arms fairs, sending naval vessels or sending soldiers to sort of promote Canadian-made weaponry. You have the Canadian Commercial Corporation, of course, that is the financing arm for a lot of weapon sales. So it's really extensive, and in so many different ways in which the government directly and indirectly subsidizes the arms industry, first of all by buying their product, but then also in so many different other ways subsidizing them and assisting them. So there's obviously a very important economic element to understanding the institution. So to me, the military represents all kinds of regressive cultural values. It's authoritarian. It's a bastion of far right, patriarchal kind of institution. What it does abroad is the worst part of it. It kills and becomes a tool of imperialism and dispossession. And so it's an institution that we want to do as much as we can to either defund or eliminate. And that, of course, is not easy to do that. It's a matter of organizing, it's a matter of building the peace movement, it's a matter of being clear that this is an institution that is not designed to protect us, right? Us being the majority of the population. It's designed to protect class and imperialist interests. And it's about building peace and anti-war activism to defund the military. It's not easy. Again, it's just a massive institution with all kinds of political power, and we're in a time, unfortunately, where, certainly in the last 8 months, where it was, 8 or 9 months ago, it was to call for defunding the military was a pretty marginal idea, and it's become even a tougher sell in the corporate media now than it was 8 or 9 months ago. But if you actually look, one interesting thing on public attitudes around the military is that the Canadian polls show that Canadians are generally pretty sympathetic to the institution, but they consistently consider the military at the bottom of their priorities, be it their political priorities. So they'll say, what's concerning you politically, and it's like the economy, the environment, healthcare, whatever, or their priorities when it comes to public spending, right? Consistently, people that we want healthcare, we want daycare, we want education, and the military is consistently at the bottom of what people want more public resources to go to. So that's even without that's with a fairly dormant anti-war movement. The popular attitudes are decent, I would say, in terms of campaigning against military spending. But yeah, it's a matter of work, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.